I want you to imagine, just for a moment, that you're sitting in a jury box.
Okay, setting the scene.
Right. And in your hands, you hold the actual physical evidence of a brutal crime. Like the timeline is laid out perfectly right in front of you.
The motive is super clear.
Exactly. The motive is clear. The weapon is accounted for. By literally every metric of logic and reason, the person sitting at that defense table is entirely guilty.
But then you look at them.
Yeah, you look at them and you realize that convicting this person would mean completely dismantling your entire understanding of how the world works.
Wow, yeah. It would mean admitting that the societal structures you rely on to just feel safe are basically an illusion.
Right. So you look at all this bloody evidence and you choose to ignore it.
It's honestly a terrifying facet of human psychology. I mean, we are wired to crave a universe that just makes sense, where truth is this objective, immovable object.
But it's not, is it?
No. History repeatedly shows us that when objective truth collides with, like, a fiercely protected cultural illusion, the illusional almost always wins. People will completely bend reality just to protect the narrative they need to be true.
Which perfectly sets up what we're doing today. Welcome to this deep dive, everyone. Today we are taking you on a journey right into the dark intersection of true crime and public perception.
It's a heavy one today.
It really is. We are pulling from a massive stack of source material spanning all the way from the Victorian era right up to the modern digital age.
Yeah, we're looking at cold-blooded poisoners, a disgraced Olympian, a cryptic serial killer, and some really infamous historical figures.
And the mission today for this deep dive is to uncover this chilling shared thread between all of them. We're looking at how perpetrators, and honestly sometimes the justice system itself, manipulate societal biases, gender norms, and the media to just completely control the narrative.
We are essentially going to look at what happens when the story of a crime completely eclipses the actual truth of the crime itself.
So let's start by looking at how societal assumptions can create, like, the ultimate camouflage. I was reading through the source material on the 1892 double murder of Andrew and Abby Borden in Massachusetts.
Oh, the Lizzie Borden case.
Yeah, and the sheer visceral brutality of this crime is it's jarring. I mean, two people hacked to death with an axe in their own home.
It's incredibly violent.
But what I keep getting stuck on is the immediate aftermath. Like, how does a prime suspect, in this case the daughter, Lizzie Borden, navigate those first few days of police scrutiny, given the overwhelming physical reality of what just happened?
Well, to understand that immediate aftermath, you really have to look at the mechanics of police investigations in the late 19th century, right? Combined with the extreme psychological shock of the community.
Right, they weren't exactly using DNA swabbing back then.
Exactly. When investigators arrived at the Borden house, they were looking at a really close quarters, extraordinarily bloody double homicide. The perpetrator would have been completely covered in physical evidence.
And Lizzie was the only other person known to be in the house, right?
Yeah, or at least on the property during both murders.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, occurred hours apart.
Which is wild to think about. She's just hanging around.
Right. But when police actually questioned her, her alibi was entirely fluid. Like, she told one officer she was in the barn looking for lead sinkers for a fishing trip.
Like fishing trip.
Yeah, and then she told another officer she was eating pears in the loft. She claimed she heard a groan, then later claimed she heard nothing at all.
See, any modern investigator, or frankly any logical investigator of that era, would view a shifting timeline as a huge red flag.
Oh, it's the primary indicator of deception. It means the suspect is basically constructing a narrative in real time and struggling to keep the details consistent.
And it goes way beyond just verbal contradictions, too. There's this whole incident with the dress.
Oh, the dress. That part is wild.
It really is. The sources note that just days after the murders, while the house is still essentially an active crime scene under police observation, Lizzie is caught in the kitchen tearing up a dress and throwing it into the stove to burn.
Right in front of people.
Yes. And when a friend points out how incredibly suspicious this looks, Lizzie just claims the dress was stained with paint.
Right.
I mean, I find it so hard to wrap my head around how an investigator watches the prime suspect in a bloody axe murder incinerate her clothing and doesn't just immediately put her in handcuffs.
Well, you have to look at the motive alongside that destruction of evidence to really see the full picture of the prosecution's case. Andrew Borden was staggeringly wealthy, and he was notoriously frugal.
So there was tension there.
Deep, documented tension in the household regarding his estate and how he was distributing property, particularly to Abby's family. So upon his death, Lizzie and her sisters stood to inherit a massive fortune.
Okay, so you have the holy trinity of criminal prosecution right there. Means motive and opportunity.
Exactly. She was present. She had a profound financial incentive, and she was actively destroying potential physical evidence while offering contradictory statements.
On paper, without the context of who she was, it is an airtight, open and shut case.
Completely airtight. But as we know, the context is everything here.
Right, because when this case actually goes to trial, that airtight paper case completely disintegrates. And it seems it disintegrates not because the defense introduced some, like, brilliant alternative theory, but because the jury simply refused to process the facts.
They couldn't compute it.
Put yourself in that Massachusetts courtroom. You are looking at a jury made entirely of men?
A jury of Victorian men, specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where we have to really dissect the sociology of 1892.
Set the stage for us.
So this was an era defined by rigid social stratification and these deeply ingrained, almost scientific beliefs about gender. The prevailing worldview among the men who sat on that jury was that a woman of Lizzie Borden's class—
Meaning wealthy, right.
Right. A wealthy, property-owning Sunday school teacher who attended the right church and wore the right clothes. They believed she was physiologically and psychologically incapable of savage violence.
It's just so bizarre to think about.
Their paradigm allowed for violence among the lower classes, sure, or among marginalized groups. But a proper Victorian lady, she was viewed as fragile, delicate, and just morally pure by nature.
I'm trying to wrap my head around the cognitive dissonance required to maintain that belief while looking at autopsy photos of an axe attack.
It's a massive disconnect.
It feels akin to, like, watching a high-definition video of an accountant robbing a bank, but the jury acquits him because they believe people who know Excel simply don't have the muscle memory to hold a gun.
That is a hilariously accurate analysis.
I mean, the facts are subordinated entirely to the stereotype.
It is a perfect example of confirmation bias on a systemic scale. For that jury to convict Lizzie Borden, they would have had to do more than just send a woman to prison.
They have to break their whole reality.
Exactly. They would have had to dismantle their entire worldview. If a wealthy, church-going woman from one of the town's best families could brutally slaughter her parents in the middle of the day, then the Victorian social order was a lie.
Which means the people they shared pews with, the women in their own homes, were capable of unimaginable things.
And the psychological cost of finding her guilty was simply too high for them. It was much easier, much safer to rationalize the destroyed dress, ignore the shifting alibis, and just dismiss the financial motive entirely.
They acquitted her to protect their own reality.
They absolutely did.
And the sources confirm she lived the rest of her life in relative comfort, using the very inheritance that was her motive. All because her society's sexism functioned as this, like, impenetrable defense strategy.
She didn't even have to aggressively manipulate them. She just had to sit there and let their own biases do all the heavy lifting.
But as society evolves, the way perpetrators use societal roles evolves too. If Lizzie Borden used her status as a passive shield, the source material introduces us to cases where the societal role is used as the actual weapon.
Right, moving from defense to offense.
Exactly. I want to look at Velma Barfield now because we move from the Victorian proper lady to the modern perfect caregiver.
This represents a really distinct shift in the psychology of the crime. We are moving from a single explosive act of violence in a Victorian home to a calculated, protracted campaign of murder that requires immense ongoing deception.
And Velma Barfield's method is deeply unsettling. The sources describe her as occupying this incredibly trusted space.
Yes, the ultimate position of trust.
She is taking care of sick relatives. She is nursing elderly boyfriends. These are people who are incredibly vulnerable, who are completely relying on her for their daily survival.
And she is methodically lacing their meals with poison.
Which is just horrific.
Yeah.
What strikes me about poisoning as a method is how profoundly different it is from pulling a trigger or swinging an axe. An axe murder is adrenaline and rage.
It's explosive.
Yeah. But poison, to sit there and feed someone lethal soup day after day, watching them wither away while you play the role of the comforting nurse, that requires a terrifying level of detachment.
You were touching on the unique psychological profile of the poisoner there. It is arguably one of the most transgressive forms of murder because it requires an extreme subversion of intimacy.
Subversion of intimacy? I like that phrasing.
Well, a poisoner doesn't strike from the shadows. You know, they operate in the light. They're often sitting right at the bedside.
Holding their hand.
Exactly. They stroke the victim's hair. They offer sips of water. They literally listen to the victim complain about the very symptoms a poisoner is actively causing.
That is so dark.
It is a God complex disguised as compassion. The poisoner controls the victim's pain, their deterioration, and ultimately the exact moment of their death, all while absorbing the gratitude of the victim and the praise of the community for being such a dedicated caregiver.
And the motive here, again, is incredibly base. It's just life insurance. She is collecting payouts from these mysterious deaths. The sources note she killed multiple people, including her own mother.
Her own mother. It's chilling.
But what I really want to understand is the mechanical failure of the systems around her. Why do doctors not catch this immediately? Why do family members just accept that people around Velma keep dying?
It's a great question.
Because we talk about the jury being blinded in the Borden case, but here the medical and familial communities were completely blind.
Well, the blindness here is rooted in our evolutionary and social need to trust the caregiver. Human survival relies entirely on the family unit and the assumption of mutual care.
Right. If you can't trust the person giving you medicine, what do you have?
Exactly. If you cannot trust the person handing you medicine when you are bedridden, the basic social contract evaporates. Velma Barfield weaponized that fundamental human vulnerability.
And what about the doctors?
Furthermore, you have to look at medical biases, particularly regarding the elderly and the sick. When a young, healthy person suddenly dies, an autopsy is standard. Red flags are raised everywhere.
But with older patients.
Right. When an elderly person, or someone already suffering from a chronic ailment, passes away, the medical establishment is primed to view it as the natural progression of age or disease.
Oh, wow. So they just assume it was their time.
A doctor looks at a grieving daughter who has been dutifully tending to her elderly mother and sees tragedy, not homicide. Barfield understood that the context of caregiving created a massive blind spot for both investigators and physicians.
It wasn't until the bodies kept piling up and the statistical improbability became too massive to ignore that the authorities finally looked past the grieving caregiver persona.
The math just started making sense.
Right. She was eventually caught and became the first woman executed in the U.S. since 1962. It just leaves you with this chilling realization that the most dangerous place a person could be was in her care, precisely because society is programmed to look away from the caregiver.
We just don't want to see it.
We really don't. And this brings up a fascinating pivot point. We've been discussing how individuals manipulate the narrative to hide from the justice system. But the source material also forces us to examine what happens when the justice system itself is the entity manipulating the narrative.
That is a very different, very dangerous dynamic.
Yeah. What happens when the authorities are under such immense pressure that they decide a compelling story is more valuable than factual truth?
You are describing the phenomenon of the systemic scapegoat. The justice system, military tribunals, governmental bodies, these are not unfeeling algorithms. They are institutions run by human beings.
Human beings who panic.
Exactly. Human beings who are susceptible to panic, public pressure, and the desperate need to maintain order. When an institution is failing, its primary instinct is self-preservation. And often the easiest way to preserve the institution is to manufacture a villain.
Which leads us directly into the incredible tragic story of Mata Hari during World War I.
Yes, Mata Hari.
If you look at her origins, there is nothing about her that suggests international espionage. She was born Margaretha Zell, a simple Dutch woman, but she engages in this act of total, masterful reinvention.
A complete overhaul of her identity.
She moves to Paris and creates this entirely new persona. Mata Hari, this exotic, mysterious Eastern dancer. She takes the city by storm. She lives a glamorous life, performing sensual dances, and takes powerful lovers across Europe. We're talking politicians, military officers, industrialists.
Her reinvention was a masterpiece of social navigation. I mean, the early 20th century, before the war, Europe had a very different border fluidity, especially for someone occupying the upper echelons of society.
She was kind of everywhere.
Right. Mata Hari represented a type of cosmopolitan independence that was highly unusual for a woman of her era. She spoke multiple languages, she traveled freely between Paris, Berlin, and The Hague, and she cultivated intimacies with men across rival nations.
Which was fine during peacetime, right?
Exactly. In peacetime, this made her a celebrated socialite and a bohemian icon.
But then the context completely fractures. World War I breaks out. And the very things that made her an icon, her international mobility, her lack of national allegiance, her lovers in both the German and French militaries, suddenly make her a massive liability.
Overnight, she goes from an icon to a threat.
I really want to dive into the specific conditions in France at the time of her arrest. Like, Why her and why then?
To understand her execution, you really have to understand the catastrophic state of the French military in 1917. This was the height of trench warfare.
He was brutal.
Unimaginable casualties. Entire offensives were resulting in hundreds of thousands of deaths for mere yards of mud. Morale had completely collapsed, to the point where there were widespread, terrifying mutinies within the French ranks.
So the soldiers were literally refusing to fight.
Yes, the military high command was facing a complete loss of control and a highly critical civilian population back home. They could not simply admit that their tactics were failing or that the war was a meat grinder.
They needed a distraction.
They desperately needed an external explanation for this systemic failure. They needed someone to blame.
So they look at Mata Hari. Here is a woman who sleeps with German officers and French officers, who crosses borders, and who lives a lavish lifestyle while French boys are dying in the trenches.
The perfect target.
The authorities accuse her of being a master spy, passing critical secrets to the Germans, and essentially blaming her for the deaths of thousands of soldiers. But when historians look back at the actual evidence presented at her military tribunal, the sources indicate it is shockingly hollow.
Extremely hollow.
It seems they didn't really have proof of espionage at all.
No, the historical consensus today is that the evidence was extraordinarily circumstantial. Much of it was fabricated or grossly exaggerated by French intelligence.
So what was she actually doing?
She likely passed low-level gossip, not strategic military secrets. But the military tribunal wasn't convened to discover the truth. It was a theatrical production designed to achieve a specific public relations outcome.
A show trial.
Precisely. They weren't just prosecuting her for alleged espionage, they were prosecuting her morality. In the eyes of the conservative military establishment, her sexuality, her independence, and her refusal to conform to the traditional suffering wartime female archetype made her inherently guilty.
That is wild.
The prosecutor actually argued that her bohemian lifestyle itself was evidence of her treacherous nature.
It's as if they decided her lack of conventional patriotism was a capital offense. To use a more modern framing, she was essentially an early influencer whose brand was international glamour.
That's the great way to put it.
And when the structural integrity of the French military began to collapse, the authorities found it much easier to put an influencer in front of a firing squad than to take accountability for their own tactical incompetence.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. Executing Mata Hari solved a massive psychological problem for the French state. It gave the public a tangible face for their grief.
It gave them an easy answer.
Right. It told the grieving mothers of France, your sons did not die because of our bad strategy. They died because of this seductive foreign traitor. Justice was entirely subordinated to the need for a cohesive national narrative.
It is a devastating example of a system executing an innocent woman because they just needed a villain, but the sources provide an equally disturbing inverse to this dynamic.
Oh, Homolka pace.
Yeah. If Mata Hari was an innocent woman killed by a system that needed a scapegoat, Karla Homolka is the monster who walked free because the system desperately needed to believe she was a victim. Let's look at this case out of Canada, because the mechanics of how the justice system was manipulated here are infuriating.
The Homolka case forces us to really examine the rigid, often blinding archetypes the legal system uses to process domestic violence and comorbidity in serial crimes.
The reality of the crime is almost too dark to process. Karla Homolka and her husband, Paul Bernardo, were a serial killing couple. And the detail that anchors the horror of this is that Karla actively helped Paul assault and murder her own 15-year-old sister, Tammy.
Along with other victims, yes.
Right. But when the police finally close in on Bernardo, Karla immediately initiates this masterful manipulation of the authorities. She completely leans into the battered woman syndrome.
She plays the part perfectly.
She paints a picture of herself as a terrified, helpless captive who is violently coerced into participating by her sadistic husband.
And we have to look closely at why prosecutors are so susceptible to this specific narrative. The criminal justice system is heavily reliant on the concept of a primary aggressor.
Meaning they need a ringleader.
Exactly. When investigators find a male-female killing team, the deeply ingrained institutional bias immediately assumes the male is the dominant architect of the violence and the female is subservient, perhaps coerced, or acting out of fear.
Which goes back to those gender biases we talked about with Lizzie Borden.
Totally. The trope of the helpless female victim is incredibly powerful because it aligns with traditional patriarchal views of gender. Homolka recognized this bias and fed the prosecutors exactly the script they expected to read.
She gives them the sob story, and the prosecutors take the bait completely. They are so desperate to secure a slam-dunk conviction against Paul Bernardo, who is clearly the primary target in their minds, that they offer Karla Homolka a deal.
A very generous deal.
Shockingly lenient, she is offered a mere 12 years in prison in exchange for full cooperation and testimony against Bernardo. I really want to ask about the mechanics of these deals. Why would prosecutors rush to sign an agreement like this before they've even finished fully processing the evidence?
Well, plea bargaining is the engine of the modern justice system. Without it, the courts would completely collapse under the volume of trials.
Because trials take too much time and money.
Yes, and prosecutors operate on risk assessment. Trials are unpredictable. Juries are unpredictable. When a prosecutor is facing a high-profile, high-pressure case like a serial killer, securing the testimony of an insider is viewed as the ultimate insurance policy.
So they just jumped the gun.
They locked in the deal quickly because they believed they understood the totality of the power dynamic between Bernardo and Homolka. They thought they were granting leniency to an abused woman in order to put away a monster.
And they were so wrong.
They allowed their eagerness for a guaranteed conviction to override exhaustive investigative patience.
Which leads to one of the most sickening twists in modern legal history. The ink is dry on the plea deal, the contract is legally binding, and then police discover a series of hidden videotapes.
The tapes change everything.
When investigators sit down and watch these tapes, the entire narrative the prosecutors built their case on just evaporates. The tapes show the actual crimes taking place, and they prove, with objective visual certainty, that Karla Homolka was not a helpless victim crying in the corner.
Not at all.
She was an eager, joyful, active participant. She is seen directing the abuse, enjoying the suffering of the victims, including her own sister.
The videotapes are the ultimate objective truth colliding with the convenient narrative. For the prosecutors, watching those tapes must have been a moment of profound professional and psychological horror.
I can't even imagine being in that room.
They realized they had just negotiated a highly lenient sentence for a primary predator. The tape stripped away the societal bias and revealed the pure pathology underneath.
But because of how the legal system works, they couldn't just tear up the deal, could they?
No, they could not. The state had entered into a binding legal contract based on the information available at the time of signing.
God, it's so frustrating.
It is, but to retroactively cancel a plea agreement because new evidence emerges undermines the foundational legality of the plea bargain system itself. If the state can back out of a deal, no defense attorney would ever advise a client to take one.
Wow, okay, so their hands were tied by their own system.
Exactly. So the system was forced to honor a contract signed with a monster, entirely because the prosecutors allowed their own biases to dictate the pace and scope of the investigation.
The public reaction was, understandably, total outrage. I mean, the idea of the deal with the devil had literally played out in real life, and the devil won. Paul Bernardo received a life sentence, but Karla Homolka served her 12 years and walked out of prison.
She did her time and left.
The sources note she now lives under a new identity, married, with children, while the families of her victims are left with a shattered faith in the concept of justice. It just leaves you wondering how many negotiations are happening in district attorney offices right now where a perpetrator is successfully spinning a fake narrative that perfectly aligns with a prosecutor's blind spots.
It's a sobering thought, for sure.
But I want to shift gears here. We've looked at killers hiding behind societal norms, and we've looked at systems manipulating the public or being manipulated by criminals. I want to spend some time exploring crimes that were not meant to be hidden.
Crimes that were meant to be seen.
Yes, crimes that were specifically designed to be public spectacles, where the media manipulation wasn't an afterthought, but the primary objective. Let's start with a case where the spectacle happened almost by accident, fueled by intense class dynamics and public pressure. We have to go back to 1994, just weeks before the Winter Olympics.
This brings us to Tonya Harding and Nancy Kerrigan.
Yep.
This case is a fascinating study in how immense public pressure, class resentment, and the hyper-competitive environment of elite sports can completely fracture a person's decision-making process.
To understand the crime, you have to understand the narrative that the media had already constructed around these two women long before any violence occurred. You have Tonya Harding,
The underdog.
right, incredibly athletic, the first American woman to land a triple axel in competition. But she did not fit the pristine country club image of figure skating. She sewed her own costumes, she had a rough upbringing, she was perceived as scrappy and unpolished.
And then you have her rival.
Directly across from her is Nancy Kerrigan. Graceful, elegant, backed by major corporate sponsors wearing designer outfits. The media literally dubbed her America's sweetheart.
The media had essentially cast them in a morality play. It was the classic, wrong side of the tracks underdog against the established upper-class princess.
It's like a movie script.
It is. The pressure on Harding was immense because she wasn't just competing against Kerrigan's athletic ability. She was competing against an entire judging apparatus and a corporate media machine that clearly preferred the aesthetic and narrative of her rival.
And that pressure cooker of jealousy and desperation leads to an unthinkable decision. Harding conspires with her ex-husband, Jeff Gillily, and a group of remarkably incompetent accomplices to physically remove Kerrigan from the competition.
The execution of the plan was a disaster.
On January 6, 1994, at the U.S. Figure Skating Championships in Detroit, Kerrigan steps off the ice after a practice session. A man steps out, wields a police-style collapsible metal baton, and strikes Kerrigan viciously just above the knee.
Right on camera, basically.
Yeah. The footage of her collapsing, crying out, why, is one of the most indelible images of the 1990s. But what makes this so bizarre is the sheer clumsiness of it all. They didn't hire a professional ghost. They hired a guy who used his own credit card, left a trail of obvious clues, and the entire conspiracy unraveled in a matter of days.
It lacked any of the calculated sophistication of a Barfield or a Borden. It was an act of brutal physical sabotage driven by sheer panic.
Just a mess.
But the clumsiness is exactly what fueled the spectacle. Because the crime was so poorly executed, the investigation played out in real time on national television. It became a daily soap opera.
It reminds me of someone trying to win a high-stakes poker game by just flipping the table over, but doing it in a room full of cameras and somehow hoping the dealer won't notice.
That's exactly what it was.
It was a complete act of public self-destruction. Kerrigan recovers, she goes to the Olympics and wins a silver medal. Harding's career is utterly decimated. She pleads guilty to hindering the prosecution, receives a lifetime ban from the U.S. Figure Skating Association, and becomes a national pariah.
And the media consumed the narrative voraciously because it perfectly validated the stereotypes they had already built.
They got their perfect ending.
Exactly. The thug had acted like a thug, and the princess became a martyr who bravely returned to the ice. The crime itself became secondary to the massive cultural conversation about class, expectation, and female rivalry.
Which is wow.
Harding tried to violently alter the outcome of a public event, but she fundamentally underestimated how the media infrastructure would instantly turn her act of desperation into a globally broadcast tragedy.
Harding's crime was a spectacle of incompetence that the media capitalized on. But our final case study takes this dynamic and turns it completely upside down.
Right, the Zodiac Killer.
What happens when the perpetrator is the one capitalizing on the media? What happens when a killer understands the infrastructure of the press so well that he uses it to hold an entire region hostage?
This is a profound shift in criminal methodology. The Zodiac represents a perpetrator who recognized that mass communication could be weaponized.
Weaponized how?
He understood that violence in a vacuum only terrorizes the immediate victim, but violence broadcast through the press can terrorize millions.
The reign of terror begins in the late 1960s in Northern California. Brutal, seemingly random attacks on couples in lovers' lanes, a taxi driver murdered in the city. The physical crimes are horrific. But the sources make it very clear that for the Zodiac, the murders were essentially just phase one. They were the buy-in.
They were just how he got their attention.
Because what happens next is unprecedented. He doesn't go into hiding. He initiates a massive, complex correspondence with the local newspapers, specifically the San Francisco Chronicle, the Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald.
He began sending letters, claiming responsibility, providing specific details of the crime scenes that only the killer could know to verify his identity.
But he didn't just write letters.
No, he sent complex ciphers, cryptograms.
I really want to dig into these ciphers, because this isn't just a killer taunting the police. This is a killer assigning homework to the public. He sends these intricate grids of symbols and letters, and he includes an explicit threat. He demands that the newspapers print these ciphers on the front page. If they refuse, he threatens to go on a killing rampage over the weekend.
The mechanics of this extortion are brilliant in a deeply malicious way. By threatening mass violence, he forced the editors of these major newspapers into an impossible ethical dilemma.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Right. Do we give a platform to a serial killer, or do we risk the blood of a dozen people on our hands?
So they complied. They printed the ciphers, and in doing so, they unwittingly became his public relations firm.
They amplified him.
The Zodiac hijacked the infrastructure of the free press to amplify his reach. He turned a localized murder investigation into a participatory, region-wide psychological thriller.
That is exactly what it was, participatory. When those ciphers hit the front page, thousands of ordinary citizens sat at their breakfast tables, drinking coffee, trying to decode the messages. A high school teacher and his wife actually cracked the first one.
That is so crazy to me.
But by engaging with the puzzle, the public was playing his game. He had successfully invaded their homes, their minds, their morning routines. The murderers gave him the credibility to make the threats, but the media gave him the power.
He loved it.
Oh, he enjoyed seeing the panic. He enjoyed mocking the police in print. It raises the question, was the Zodiac primarily a murderer, or was he a domestic terrorist who merely used murder as a marketing tool for his own massive ego?
I mean, I lean toward the latter. What did the sources say?
The psychological profile strongly leans toward the latter.
Yeah.
The need for an audience was paramount. Serial killers often seek a feeling of omnipotence, a godlike control over life and death.
And he scaled that.
Exactly. The Zodiac scaled that need. He didn't just want control over his victims in an isolated parking lot. He wanted control over the news cycle, the police department, and the daily emotional state of the entire Bay Area. He achieved a level of infamy where the myth of the Zodiac became far larger than the man himself.
And for over 50 years, that myth held strong. The Zodiac essentially won the game he created. His identity remained a complete mystery, a terrifying ghost story.
Until very recently.
Yes. The sources bring us to a fascinating climax in the timeline of objective truth versus narrative. The Zodiac built a myth using the technology of his time, the printing press, the mail system, the limitations of 1960s forensics. But he couldn't account for the future.
He had no idea what was coming.
In the modern era, specifically around 2022, there was a massive breakthrough regarding the Zodiac's ciphers, but more importantly regarding the use of DNA in cold cases.
This is where we see empirical science slowly dismantling the untouchable myth. The breakthrough doesn't come from a brilliant detective having a sudden epiphany in a smoky room. It comes from the cold, microscopic mechanics of genetic genealogy.
I want to make sure we understand how this actually works, because it's completely changing the landscape of criminal justice. How does genetic genealogy reach back 50 years to unravel a cold case?
It relies on the massive databases created by commercial ancestry websites. In the 1960s, a killer might leave behind microscopic traces of skin cells, sweat, or saliva on the flap of an envelope or a stamp.
Which meant nothing back then.
Back then, it was meaningless. But today, forensic scientists can extract a DNA profile from that half-century-old saliva. They then upload that profile into public genealogy databases.
But the killer didn't upload their own DNA, right?
Right. They aren't looking for a direct match to the killer. They're looking for the killer's third or fourth cousins. Once they find a distant relative who shares a small percentage of that DNA, genealogists work backward.
Oh, wow. Building out the family tree.
Exactly. They build massive family trees, tracing lineages back to the 1800s, and then trace forward along different branches until they find an individual who fits the age, location, and physical profile of the suspect. It is a mathematical, biological net that slowly tightens around the perpetrator.
It is the ultimate triumph of raw, undeniable data over a carefully constructed narrative. The Zodiac used the media to turn himself into an omnipotent phantom, but genetic genealogy reduces that phantom to a very real, very human family tree.
The science doesn't care about the myth.
Exactly. The narrative he spent years building is finally collapsing under the weight of microscopic evidence that he didn't even know he was leaving behind. It is incredibly satisfying to see that eventually the objective truth has a mechanism to fight back against the story.
It really is.
We have covered a tremendous amount of ground today, pulling from a really diverse array of source material. Put yourself back in that jury box we talked about at the beginning. We've seen how Victorian men looked at Lizzie Borden's bloody crime scene and chose to see a delicate Sunday school teacher.
We watched the medical establishment look at Velma Barfield's poisoned victims and see only the tragic passing of the elderly.
We saw the French military sacrifice Mata Hari simply because a grieving nation needed a villain to blame for the trenches.
And we witnessed Karla Homolka weaponize the trope of the helpless female to secure a plea deal that let her walk away from unimaginable horror.
And finally, we watched the Zodiac Killer hold the printing presses of California hostage to feed his own God complex.
The thematic journey through these cases is profound and, honestly, deeply unsettling. Across different centuries, utilizing vastly different technologies, the central vulnerability of human society remains constant.
The story always wins out.
Yes, the raw, objective facts of a crime are consistently vulnerable to the narrative wrapped around them. Whether as a jury, a judge, an editor, or the general public, we are all susceptible to a compelling story, especially when that story validates our pre-existing biases, fears, or desires.
It fundamentally changes how you consume information. It forces you to look at a news broadcast or a court verdict and ask, am I seeing the truth or am I just seeing the narrative the system is comfortable with?
That is the big question.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with today. Something for you to mull over as you navigate the rest of your week. We've talked extensively about how people manipulated reality using the tools available in their era. Victorian social etiquette, 1990s cable television, 1960s newspapers.
But the tools have changed.
They have. Look around at the digital landscape you live in right now. We exist in an era where the tools for narrative manipulation are decentralized and infinitely powerful. Anyone with a smartphone can shape a narrative globally in an instant.
Deepfakes, AI, all of it.
Exactly. We have deepfakes that can manufacture video evidence out of thin air. We have algorithms designed specifically to feed our confirmation biases and isolate us in echo chambers. You can craft an entirely synthetic persona, complete with a fabricated history and a legion of artificial followers in a matter of hours.
It's easier than ever to tell a convincing lie.
It really is. Knowing how easily experienced investigators, judges, and entire societies were fooled in the past by a nice dress, a few fake tears, or a clever cipher, how many modern perpetrators might be walking free right now, hiding in plain sight, simply because they know exactly which of our modern digital biases to exploit?
It is a question that requires us to be more vigilant than ever. It demands that we cultivate a relentless skepticism, prioritizing verifiable facts over the comfort of a well-told story.
It absolutely does. You cannot take the story at face value anymore. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly intense deep dive into the source material. It has been a fascinating, disturbing, and deeply illuminating journey. Until next time, keep looking past the narrative and keep asking the hard questions.